Why did Visual Basic die? I've been a software developer for almost 30 years. I remember using VB back in the 90s, and I was thinking about it the other day and it dawned on me, despite all the advances in technology since then, nothing I have found compares to that development experience today. I would go so far as to say we've gone backwards in a big way. Now, I'm no fan of Microsoft products, but I have yet to find a tool that can allow me to be as productive in so short a time as Visual Basic. Yet I can't help wondering what problems it had that caused them to abandon it. Moreover, why hasn't someone come out with a solid replacement? I actually wrote a long article on this one and had a chance to interview some of the team that built the original version of VB that was sold to Microsoft. Alan Cooper and Michael Geary. Michael actually frequents HN pretty regularly. My opinion is that it was a confluence of a few factors. Microsoft was very worried about the threat of Java/Sun, and rotated hard into .NET, and the Common Language Runtime as a response. The most vocal, but minority of VB users wanted more advanced functionality, and a more powerful/expressive language, as is often the case. Coupled with the shift to .NET, Microsoft listened to them. VB got a full rewrite into an object-oriented language, and the IDE moved further away from the VB6 visual building paradigm. That left the silent majority high and dry. The web emerged. Working with the Win32 API was suddenly less relevant, and younger devs adopted PHP en masse, rather than adopting VB. And existing VB6 devs upset about the change also migrated over when they could build for the web instead of Windows, unforced error on Microsoft's part, since EA had 96% browser market share in 2001. 1. The web and the way MS handle the web killed it. Microsoft was pushing everyone towards these horrible active components. Many moved to PHP or Adobe Flash. And I was using MS Access back in the day to solve business problems. It was like a VB6 DSL focused fully on data-driven applications. It was extremely time efficient thanks to that focus. What took me days to build took a VB developer, or PHP developer, months. That died thanks to web, and the web version being horrific, and a data leak waiting to happen. The move to C# and the path they've followed since then was, looking back, the way to go. I only wish that they had done more to make the experience for native programmers better out of the box. Greater than the most vocal, but minority of VB users wanted more advanced functionality and a more powerful/expressive language, as is often the case. This is the single reason why most computing tools, not limited to VB, never reached wide enough audience. The nerds keep asking for complexity, but the majority actually wanted even more simplicity. HyperCard, Delphi, VB6, Flash. This article was excellent. At Rylook, I read it a few months ago when it was first published and passed it on to just about everyone I know in my MSFD network. I cut my teeth on VB6 back in the day. For someone that didn't know much about programming at the time, it felt like I suddenly had found a new set of superpowers. VB6 was a big confidence booster plus momentum builder that set me on a path to a happy career. Awesome that you were able to connect with Alan and Michael, and thanks for the trip down memory lane. Greater than VB got a full rewrite into an object-oriented language, and the IDE moved further away from the VB6 visual building paradigm. What do you mean by this? Visual Studio today has a designer, code editor that works in a very similar way to VB6 that I remember. What do you think is missing? VB.NET was a bit weird, yes, but Visual Basic did need work. VB6 did not have multi-threading, which was really starting to hurt its efficacy by 2002. You could work around it by using events as much as possible, but there were still some things that were blocking. Also, the events were not even on a separate thread either, leading to the need to do events everywhere. This was a deal breaker for VB to ever become a serious language, and kept it squarely in the hobby bob, prototyping arena. But who wants to prototype in a language that requires a full rewrite in another language to go to production? In the long run this was always unsustainable. The rewrite, too. Net fixed this, but it was a significant departure from VB underpinnings and in particular the seamless WinForms integration that was pretty amazing. Also, with Net came multilingual capability and C# got really popular quickly and displaced VB.NET. As someone who loved coding in VB6, I actually dreamt about it the other night, thought I woke up some 20 years ago. Very cool that you got to interview the VB team, your article is high on my reading list, smile. To Op's point, I recently started doing some things in Swift with Xcode and found Sim having just as much fun. I'm using Swift UI. So maybe not the same experience for everyone, but I wanted to share here. VB and the web. The VB model for rendering web pages was active server pages and server-side rendering. Very similar to Java server pages. Which was still better than PHP, but the IDE did not have a community version and PHP was easier to get started and was being taught in college curriculum. EA having so much browser market also killed anything MS because they always tried to create their own standards which nobody wanted to follow. The client side was so difficult to script with having to test which browser and accommodate quirks mode. Another unforced error. Corporate adopters are still trying sunset critical apps which only run in EA or Edge with EA mode turned on. I do not think the problem with VB was the language. I think it was the graphic, UI expressive power, a simple way to add and create custom components. At the same time that both VB and Delphi reached peak usage, the web started to show how easy it is to express graphically, and UI using CSS. When you have to write tons of lines of code in VB to get to the same as 3 lines of CSS. Visual Basic, both of them, still exist, but their use has dropped dramatically through some big changes. Visual.net, aka Visual Fred, was released by Microsoft. This was an incompatible language, confusingly also called Visual Basic. I don't think Microsoft realized how angry this made developers and businesses, who were being asked to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, USD, to rewrite code just to keep the same functionality. Before that time, many thought that Visual Basic's wide use gave it a kind of herd immunity. I don't have numbers with me, but I remember that years later that a study found that some were sticking to the original Visual Basic, even though it was no longer supported. A few had moved to Visual.net, and many other had abandoned Visual Basic entirely, some to C#, others beyond. In short, the Visual Basic community was split into multiple communities, and anyone using Visual Basic would have to worry about either lack of support or yet another harmful change. The rise of the web and of platforms other than Windows, including Android, iOS, macOS, Linux. Visual Basic is fine when you send files via SneakerNet to another Windows user. Now people want to access through their web browser, smartphone, etc. If you have a website, anything can access it, as long as they have the permissions, and you don't have to worry about synchronizing data changes the way you do if people make changes on their local device. Most of the simple fill-in a form kinds of applications that Visual Basic was used for are more sensibly web applications, server-side or client-side. Visual Basic is still used. And yes, I think there could be better tools for developing software. But as best as I recall, that's how we ended up here. As someone who was writing Visual Basic.net back when it came out, there was no upside to it over writing in C#. VB's original sweet spot was for writing small scripts and apps in Windows, and it was the only language available. When the .NET line came out, you could do the same things in whichever language you wanted. When new tasks came in, I started defaulting to C# for that reason. I don't think anyone actually prefers VB syntax. C# has a pretty robust community around it now. Visual Basic is one of the best arguments for open source and community ownership in the history of computing. emo. Microsoft's decision to tank it was hugely painful for companies that had made major investments in it. No company should make that kind of investment in a proprietary platform that can be killed off by a single company and not forked and maintained by others. Lol, my first programming gig as a teenager was performing a VB6, greater than .NET upgrade of a 200K legacy desktop application, which obviously ended up being a total rewrite. Everything in my career since then has seemed easy in comparison. I was a hobby VB developer at this time and I abandoned it shortly after VB.NET without really realizing why. I also abandoned Windows completely shortly thereafter. The main thing that killed me was the size of the files that you had to distribute when you used VB.NET. No one had the .NET runtime early on and it was absolutely massive. I was paying for outgoing data by the gigabyte back then and our connections were much slower. If Microsoft had simply ported Visual Basic in a compatible way to .NET, history would have been very different. What's the point of the common language runtime when all the common languages are just reskinned C#? This was a major missed opportunity for Microsoft. If they had brought Visual Basic proper in .NET, it would have given hundreds of thousands of applications a smooth upgrade path into modern development. It also would have given the entire Office suite an upgrade path from VBA to .NET, something they've still not managed. To this day, our Office still has one critical commercial third-party application written in Visual Basic. Its replacement is, of course, a web app written in .NET. Yeah. As someone who worked somewhere that had a VB6 project, VB.NET was only at all useful as a stopgap between VB and C# and a barely useful one at that. The language as it stands is fine and interop with .NET means it is a decent choice to use, outside of C#. Just having a bigger user base from a how easy can I hire devs standpoint. I wrote DTS package scripts in VBS but had primarily used C# for application development. When Sys came out with SQL Server 2015, they only released VB.NET for scripting components. It wasn't a natural transition from VBS, greater than VB.NET, so we ended up writing libraries in C# and using those in VB.NET. Brutal. I was using Visual Basic 6 for throwing GUIs together. I loved how it loaded and iterated in 1 second on a 400 MHz P3. Then, we got Visual Basic.NET. It took forever to start up. Then, it wasn't really Visual Basic. Then, iterations were slower. It was going to be a rough trip. I figured I might as well learn something different so the headaches have more of a payoff. I stayed on Visual Basic 6 for a while before quitting it. I'm using Python now and it still doesn't feel as easy as VB6 did. The reason is even bigger than just VB.ms at the time. Just decide to fully kill the enthusiast developer and the single/truly small team developer. This is mostly covered under the RAD umbrella. It kills VB, FoxPro, and now more evidently, Access, more like let it slowly die. .NET plus Visual Studio plus SQL Server are not a substitute in this market. Them are for professional developer, a small cog in a big machine. The worst part is that this move somehow kill the other tools in this space, because somehow others follow suit or whatever, and without somebody leading the charge to see how adapt this tool for the web. MS not getting the web, Borland doing Horikiri and others getting annihilated by free open source and all that not helps. Ironically, this market of rebound in the myriad of tools like low-code, notebooks, etc. that fill, badly, the gap. Serious question, what is a good alternative to Access, Edit, to build a GUI front-end to a database? The database design tools and basic forms were incredibly easy to use, and there were very good tutorials for everything else. LibreOffice Base is different and not even close in comprehensiveness, and there seems to be nothing replacing it that isn't a super expensive SaaS. Jesus Christ, not FoxPro. I briefly worked for a company whose main product had been a FoxPro application that they rewrote piece by piece in C#, re-implementing various Fox Pro idioms as they went. It was a nightmare and no one knew what any of it did. One senior developer tearfully argued with me during a code review that even fixing comments could have dire consequences. I suspect that someone higher up liked it that way, because I was fired shortly after mathematically proving that something was really wrong in some of the accounting code. Does VBA for Excel count? Because if it does, then VBA for Excel has reached the nuclear-resistant cockroach level in finance. You wouldn't believe what sort of processes in very big banks/financial institutions are built using 10-year-old VBA macros. In fact, VBA consulting for finance is a very juicy cottage industry, at least in Europe to this very day. Excel is literally 2D programming. Us mortal developers who can only put lines below one another are incapable of comprehending it, so we only get to ask the wise finance people how their enigma works. On a serious note, I dread Excel. If your PC is set to German, Excel will translate the VBA keywords to German. But if you want to type them, you have to do that in English and then have Excel translate them. I don't want to accept that crap like this is the standard. I know of a restaurant franchisee with 170 plus locations that uses a homegrown ERP system built in VBA on top of Access by an accountant about 20 years ago. I once had to update it to optimize, minimize, frontline staff working hours so the company didn't have to pay health insurance for those employees. A real nightmare of a task in more ways than one. Healthcare and insurance too. I transform into some glorious magical elf when I volunteer to do the VBA tasks nobody else understands or can lower themselves to do. You can make Excel do some real wacky stuff. I have a spreadsheet that actually calls out to exec to run a curl post on command line and consume REST API endpoints, parse the results, and update the spreadsheet. Why on earth? Because the API was ready but the web app was delayed. I was the fix. Preface, I write a lot of Baveba's kind of the result of people only wanting to use Excel for everything. I work with those people. They have mastered Excel, but have little to zero interest in learning anything else, and would rather see the world be built around Excel. So you, like me, get tasked with building applications and forms in VBA. I was stoked when MS announced Python for Excel, but alas, turned out to not be what I, and many other, wanted. What's the medicine? Dunno, hire analysts that are more open to using other tools. Don't get me wrong, I love using Excel for many tasks, but damn it, it's not the only tool. I keep saying this to all the depressed new and old programmers who believe you cannot make money anymore and it's all over. There are billions of lines of legacy shite running the biggest companies in the world. Not only COBOL and Fortran, but Excel/BA, Access, Fox Pro, and, indeed, old PHP. Companies have to choose, every year, to rewrite, or maintain. I do many projects focusing on maintain. Example, my last client had a quite to rewrite his systems in some modern crap, Next/React, for a little over 8 million used. That's the estimate, not a fixed price and of course no guarantees by the consultancy corp quoting it, or, we will keep their ancient PHP and Java running for 25-50K/mo, few hours work per year to do that with Docker. I have a very low tolerance for rewrites, so we go in hard against companies offering them. We make far more profit than any of them, we run well over 50%. With far less risk. Once I discovered containers, CRUDs in the late 90s and now Docker etc., I knew rewriting things is never needed. I used it as a coding layman in $15 an hour admin, clerk/secretary, roles to automate some processes that my predecessors had done by hand. Mostly just copying entries from a spreadsheet to company Excel/PowerPoint templates and printing them, without killing myself copy/pasting or going into the save/print dialog 50 times. It did its work as something any old schmuck could harness to save themselves from carpal tunnel. To that point, I imagine that there are a lot of admin jobs, or, at least, a lot of tasks, that could be almost completely automated away. It's probably not even a capability issue, but one of job security on the employee side and a lack of waves hands vaguely on the employer side. The productivity wasn't really that good. Rose-tinted glasses. All the VB apps I've seen, and still get paid to maintain/rewrite to this day in the finance world, are an order of magnitude simpler than even a simple modern website. They often only have a few users, no DevOps automation, no deployment automation, terrible logging, terrible instrumentation, no tests, unacceptable access control, tons of failure edge cases, and poor performance. Most don't even have central databases, they just sit on access and get copy-pasted around like spreadsheets. While the UI part of Visual Basic was fast and easy, so is writing a React front-end that just stores data in browser local storage, has no authentication, no logging, no monitoring, no tests, and deployment is emailing an updated JS file to customers. The complexity of modern development enables 100x better productivity across all aspects of safety, security, monitoring, error handling, maintenance, and new feature development. I can whip together a modern website that ticks all these boxes. To achieve the same in VB plus Access would be monumental. I was with you until, so is writing a React front-end. No. No, it's not. Making a functional UI in Visual Basic is child's play compared to the absolute cesspit of NIH and feature treadmill that front-end web development has become. You are gatekeeping with strawman. Don't forget that most of those VB apps you've seen were hacked together by amateurs, engineers, business and finance people, not professional programmers. It was great for their productivity. They automated their work, and they couldn't have done it in C.Basic equals beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. Exactly? The little Visual Basic I saw was always an entangled, manually tested, spaghetti code mess. Devs were productive only at the start of the project and slowed down to a crawl as things got more complex. I think for a lot of purposes, the internet kind of took over. VB was great if you needed to do something limited to a single machine. These days, we want data to be available across machines, which requires using a network, and the default network is the internet. If I'm going to be using the internet anyway, I can knock up something in HTML plus JS plus Firebase, / whatever data store, and have an application that works on any platform, and is accessible from anywhere in the world. You might need slightly more technical knowledge, but not so much that you can't have a simple CRUD app running in a day or so of work. I can write HTML / CSS / JS and a few back-end languages like PHP in my sleep, but there's no way I could hand code a web app as fast as I could a desktop app in 1997 using VB. I would love it if I could, though. You might need slightly more technical knowledge, but not so much that you can't have a simple CRUD app running in a day or so of work. Well, that's quite a professional bubble you live in. Web dev is truly a frog in a boiling water. If my VB/Delphi/Access/ PicPuddy who made various apps and hardware back in the day asked me for a platform, and I advised him to use what HN praises as simple, then pretty sure he'll never contact me with it again. I mean, yeah, CRUD is not hard to do by tutorial. But he will laugh at my CRUD explanation, because he never ever thought about implementing input data channels. It's akin to positioning heads above a cylinder to fetch a database record. Yep, this is the right answer. I was there, 23 years ago programming VB6, making apps that were wrapped up in install shield, burnt to a CD, and then mailed to our customers. We did do some web things with Apache and some C++ apps interfaced via CGI. But it seemed that overnight Java and servlets came about and made CGI bin obsolete and slow as molasses. Add in JSPs and structs and you had fully functional web apps that were fast and scalable. There was a parallel universe where VB was going to be a web scripting language. That idea got hamstrung by two things. 1. It turns out cross-platform, web compatibility was way more important than anything else, so nobody wanted to write web pages using script if that meant Netscape Navigator, Firefox couldn't read them. MS wasn't willing to either let the language go into the public or subsidize developing the engine for other browsers, so the web dev space just kinda didn't care. 2. It may have hung on as a scripting language for EA-only stacks, but the Microsoft antitrust lawsuit, and subsequent appearance of Chrome on the scene as a better enterprise browser, with its stability improvements and process sandboxing, ended that era. HTML, CSS and JS are not the best pieces of technology, otherwise there would not have been a whole industry of tools that allowed you not to touch them with a 10-foot pole. But we are stuck with them at least for a while. None of the VBA apps I ever saw needed the internet. They were mostly internal apps that connected to a corporate database over the internal LAN for stuff like keeping a register of who has checked out which van. I used VB all the way from 1.0 to 6.0. And when V.NET came out in 2002, that was exactly when all the types of GUI database projects VB6 was used for professionally, started being built in PHP/MySQL/HTML/CSS instead. The switch would have happened anyways, but the fact that .NET wasn't backwards compatible made it really easy to switch since you were going to have to learn/build something new anyway, otherwise there probably would have been a somewhat longer transition period. Microsoft really shot themselves in the foot, but the web benefited. And then on the hobbyist/personal side, that's also basically when casual developers switched from building fun Windows apps to building fun websites. So I'd mark it up entirely to web programming, replacing it on both sides. As for what a replacement might look like, Google had created App Maker, 2016 to 2020, that got replaced by AppSheet, 2020 present, which is the closest I've found for the drag-and-drop GUI/database aspect of VB6. But those have been very much geared towards business development, not kids learning programming. Maybe some parents here can chime in on what their kids are learning to program in. 1. 2. I think the answer is, because Microsoft let it. I'm a big fan of modern .NET, but my biggest complaint is that Microsoft views, and always has, the CLR as the C# language runtime and not the common language runtime. For example, see the relationship between F# and C#. The CLR is constantly getting features that are only to support features in C#, leaving F# in a position where they either don't get the feature, can't add the feature, or begrudgingly add the feature to keep up compatibility with C#, which is something it does take seriously. But this has the effect of dirtying up the F# language by either adding features that don't really belong in the language or keeping features out. The other thing is that C# consistently adds features to itself that are inspired by F#, since F# already implements these features on the CLR, thus showing their viability. So what happens is that C# continually approaches a more bloated language with a subset of it being a poor copy of F#. But then F# gets dragged along towards having a small subset of C# in it for compatibility purposes. So it's simultaneously making both languages worse. Even the Iron languages project that lead to Iron Python, Iron Ruby, etc. was a bit of a Trojan horse to test out and exercise the CLR and .NET with no intention of ever providing long-term support for those projects. The DLR, which was implemented to support those, appears to be just maintained by a skeleton crew of people invested in it, probably by those interested in keeping Iron Python up and running. I do not understand why Microsoft takes this approach. It is myopic, shows a misunderstanding of their own technology in the CLR, and ultimately turns C# into another C++, leave dead languages and projects in the wake. Greater than the other thing is that C# consistently adds features to itself that are inspired by F#, since F# already implements these features on the CLR, thus showing their viability. So what happens is that C# continually approaches a more bloated language, with a subset of it being a poor copy of F#C#, and F# sometimes remind me another pair of languages, Java and Scala. Interestingly enough, there are a small handful of things .NET and C++/CLI can do which C# can't, which enable the former languages to have better interoperability with COM interfaces. That was with .NET Framework, and I'm not sure what the story is today with .NET Core aka .NET 5+. To be fair, VB.NET originally had dynamic capabilities that C# lacked, so at least it possessed features that made its existence justifiable. However, the extreme changes required to go from VB6, greater than VB.NET, made it all kind of moot. Might as well rewrite.
Hey guys, this is the Rogue YouTuber here. I recently had a big change in my life. I had a baby daughter. Here she is. If you could do me a favor and remember to hit the subscribe button and bang the bell, I'm hoping to really create a YouTube channel that really gets people excited and brings people the best, most interesting content collated from across the internet. I'm saving up to save my little girl to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department. So please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.